Okay, so yeah, as mentioned, John and I are part of the group here, thanks, John, for listening in, making sure I don't say anything silly. So we've been doing this for a few years now, and I thought from what David asked, we'd just do a fairly quick talk. I think you said 20 or 30 minutes, David, so don't hesitate to cut me off if I get long-winded. We'll just going to talk about sort of change and evolution in the climate habitat of plants and insect species. David, you wouldn't know this bit, but I thought after we communicated, we'll show you a couple of different things as well that might be of interest. So yes, we're a multidisciplinary group. Our name changes every now and then. So yeah, we're sort of called the Economic Analysis Team in Geospatial Tools. I did my PhD in Australia. It was more in environmental economics, and we're a group comprised of ecologists and modelers, and I characterize what we do in sort of three general categories or bins. Spatial climate modeling, and that's how I first met David. I call it sort of some spatial ecology work, and then integrated bioeconomic studies, where we often try to bring some of those sorts of things together. And today I'm just going to give a quick overview of the Plant Hardiness Project and a related effort that's more focused on insects and diseases. So just a quick update, maybe, or something new for some of you. We have been working with Environment Canada, US NOAA, and the Australian National University for more than 25 years now, building these spatial climate models. It started off in Ontario, and we now sort of go continent-wide. We use a tool called ANUSPLIN, which hails from Australia. Mike Hutchison is the creator of this. It's really one of the world's leading, if not, I'm biased, but the world's leading tool for developing spatial models. For that, we've got some 80 different variables that include maximum temperature, minimum temperature, precipitation, growing season, all kinds of different bioclimatic variables that are used by different people for doing everything from looking at plant growth to bird distributions and agricultural crop modeling and hydrology. So for us, it was a means to an end, but because we spent a lot of time doing it and pay a lot of attention to data issues and work with these other folks, I think it's gained some credibility over time. So it's quite widely used, and those our models are actually part of these the climate atlases for the country. They're two big ones that I'm aware of that are being sort of sponsored by Environment Canada. The one called climatedata.ca, and also the Climate Atlas of Canada, which comes out of the University of Winnipeg. And we have some of our climate stuff online when we can, but of late there have been some issues with the web stuff. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that. And jumping into climate change, just a little bit of an overview. It's obviously important for forests. Preaching to the converted here, but there are obviously direct effects on forest health and mortality can be caused by, big important climate or weather events like droughts, late spring freezes, floods, wind events. There are also indirect effects that are affecting disturbance regimes that a lot of people here at the Forest Service make their living at. Things to do with fire and pest outbreaks, and obviously fire is a huge one, especially with what's going on in Red Lake right now. But it's a big deal, and a changing climate could have a massive. It's projected to have a massive impact on fire regimes going forward. We did a little study a few years ago looking at the costs of wildfire suppression under a changing climate, and it's actually a pretty scary thing. We published that in PLOS One 2 or 3 years ago. So a little bit of background on that I guess to my mind is a segue into the questions about how will an evolving climate affect the distribution, abundance, and productivity of forests, because that's, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. So we've had this project for a few years now that stemmed from being able to do this climate mapping. we call it the Plant Hardiness Project, or Canada's Plant Hardiness Project, where we've sort of taken the lead on plant hardiness mapping in the country. Back in the early 1960s, Agriculture Canada developed hardiness zones for the country. That work has, for the most part, been disbanded by Ag Canada, at least in terms of the mapping side of it. They do have people looking at hardiness of particular plant species and varieties and so on. But because we were doing the climate mapping, we thought, oh, we can make the maps of the hardiness zones. So, and a significant amount of time has passed since the maps were originally created. So that's one part of the Plant Hardiness Project. But the other part that is perhaps more, well, depending on who you're talking to, a little bit more science oriented or of interest to folks like yourselves or us, is the ability to be able to do species mapping or species distribution modeling. And again, a lot of that work, I would argue, hails from Australia and some of the folks that I knew over there. So once we developed these models, these spatial climate models, we started doing individual species modeling or mapping. And so I'll just explain that a little bit just to make sure that you have a sense of that. And that, I guess the intent with this is that when you look at the maps that David's referring to and interpret them, that I guess you can interpret them in the spirit that they're intended. So over time, we've gathered, I should say that this has not been our main focus, although it certainly has become has a life of its own. And over time, we've gathered some probably over 3 million plant occurrence records across North America. This includes things like from conservation data centers in Canada, Nature Conservancy in the US, the US Forest Service inventory data. We had to make agreements with all of those folks. What's it called? I forget the name. The Natural Heritage Information Center in Peterborough, that's part of the MNR. Then the individual researchers, and also master gardeners for a period of time. I'm not sure if they still do now, but I think they do. Used to get credit for making contributions to of observations that occur in, let's say, their communities. So there's data obtained from government agencies, NGOs, and citizen scientists with this project. So from the ability to have observations of where things occur, we can couple that to climate data. And we've, over time, got models for probably more than 3,000 species. We don't really make models until we have at least 30 observations. Kevin Lawrence is involved in this. Oops, David, so you've met him here. We kind of rerun them once a year when we get significant updates. Typically, if we have 30 observations, we'll run a model. And obviously more observations are better, and the more geographically distributed they are, the better. So the map that's up in the sort of top left here, you see little sort of gray dots. Those are those are the observations. So those are like, pardon me, presence only observations of the plant species. So from that, I guess I'll maybe go to the next slide. It might be, okay, well, before I get to the very next slide, this is an example of the hardiness zone, the most recent one that we've developed for Ontario. I don't know if you got that particular image, David, but this just shows you, and perhaps a little higher than the national map of the so-called hardiness zones, which are based on a hardiness index that then gets classified into a map. So if something is in the has an index of between 40 and 44, it would be 4A, and 45 to 49 would be 4B. So definitely it's changed significantly over the time that Ag Canada first did this. But I'm not going to get into too many details on that. The further west you go, the more change there have been. The further east you go, the less. And it's related to 7 different climate variables. So for here, let me just put this into the, okay. So here, are you still seeing this now? Yep, okay. I see a nod or two. So this is for sugar maple, just a bit of a working example I like to show. So the gray are the dots. The outside line that you see is Little's range. Little was a biogeographer based in the States who's quite famous. He did, sort of mapped out the ranges of numerous tree species. So the dots, you can see the dots are actually not all inside what was Little's range. We have to, I think, sometimes remember that Little's ranges were models as well. They're not sort of, I don't think he walked the line, so to speak, and found all the trees. And if you're kind of looking closely, you may see where I've got the cursor now, some other dots that look, hey, that's not where I would have thought sugar maple would be. But for what we're doing, we're trying to look at the climate tolerances or the climatic domain of species. Where species ultimately occurs in a natural setting is what you might call a realized niche. But the Plant Hardiness Project is more about the climatic niche. So, and I'm pretty confident about this dot that you see out in British Columbia, because when we first started this, there was a meteorologist who was, I think, retired, and he was from Prince George, and he heard about our work, climate mapping, and he decided, oh, I'm going to go and make a list of all the plant species that are in our local arboretum. So I got pretty good confidence in this particular observation, but it's a good point to make with respect to these observations, that it's not just about the natural distribution of the species. So from that, you can get, because we've got these great climate models, these spatially continuous models, we can get an estimate anywhere that you have the longitude and latitude for a large suite of variables. So somewhere out there, and it might actually be the Prince George one, there's one of those locations has an annual mean temperature of 1.2. And somewhere out there, there's an observation where the maximum and the annual mean temperature has a value of 19.5 degrees Celsius. So you think of that as a distribution. So between 5% and 95% of those observations, the annual mean temperature is 3.9 to 15.8. These are important for when you look at the colors of the maps. So the variables in bold are the variables that we use in making the maps that you see on the Plant Hardiness website. It includes annual mean temperature, maximum temperature of the warmest period, minimum temperature of the coldest period, annual precipitation, and precip driest quarter, warmest quarter. Now, we did lots of experiments, and we can get into all those details, but that just kind of gives you a general idea that there's at every one of these locations, we can get an estimate of climate, and from that, we can generate a climatic profile for the species. On the website, you may not have found this, you may not realize, you can actually get the climatic profile for all these variables online, and that's available at the website itself. So from that, it's just a very simple climate matching algorithm. So the yellow shows where the climate matches those 5 to 95% occurrences. And the blue, which is different colors than what you see on the regular maps, they are the remaining outliers, are basically, well, between the 0 and 5% and the 5 and 9 and the 95 and 100%. So it turns out that the yellow here is very close to Little's ranges. Surprise, surprise. Anyway, so this was, I'm just going to report on this. This was part of our recent bioscience paper where we looked at how these changed over the course of 50 years, 1931 to 1960 and 81 to 2010. And you can see it's changing a little bit. It's more probably stable further east you go, a little bit of change and a little bit of northward shift in parts of Ontario. So what we did for this particular analysis was just look at 62 tree species between those two time periods. The climate envelopes were shifting northward on an average of almost 60 kilometers over that period. So climate is shifting, the climate envelopes of the western tree species that we looked at shifted northward by about 75, so a little bit more than the east, which is again, based on what's known about climate change, very consistent. And for eastern tree species, it's the climate envelope shifted 38 kilometers. Now you may notice I'm talking about climate envelope shifting, not necessarily the trees. So trees don't shift in the same way that climate is at the moment. That's part of the issue with climate change, that climate is changing more rapidly than species could adapt. And we're not saying in the maps that you'll see that, and right here is the 2071 to 2100 for the Canadian climate model, one of the climate models. You'll see this so-called yellow or core area shifting significantly into northeastern Canada, and mostly in Quebec. We're not saying this is where the species can go, but this is where their sort of happy climate goes. And this would be a species where we're relatively confident that we've got observations, certainly from this continent, of where the tree species lives and survives pretty well. So, you know, my interpretation of this is that the species are going to be kind of outside their sort of happy zone. We don't know really how they're going to tolerate such drastic changes in their current core area. And there are variables that we're not necessarily including in these models that may have important implications for let's say, seed production and regeneration, and also competitive advantage or disadvantage over other species. This is part of like throwing the cards up in the air. It's a tricky issue, lots of science going on. We actually recently published a paper with Louis Iverson and Prasad and Anthony in the U.S. Forest Service, where we looked at some species migration models. It's just come out in the last few days, actually, in the journal Diversity and Distributions. So it tries to go a little bit deeper into this and deeper into the implications of this. But anyway, hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of that, how it works. Because David asked for it, we threw this the low bush blueberry into the pictures here, into the slides. So you can see that this picture here, the map on the top left, shows the climatic range for the 71 to 2000 period. Much of on northern Ontario, well, a good swath of northern Ontario is within the core climatic range of this species. And then over time, as you go further into the future, according to this particular scenario, which is probably the Canadian model, we just picked one of those. One of the things that's important in this is to realize is that there's no error associated with the climate change scenarios, and there's a variety of them. They all have different sort of conceptions, or they're driven by different things. It's often recommended people look at a variety of scenarios and outcomes. So, but you can see that, like the sugar maple one, that by the latter part of the century, at least for this, it does look like the climatic domain for Vaccinium angustifolium moves mostly to the sort of northeastern part of the country. I throw in a couple of other little images from this. One is that at the website, we put a lot of effort into putting in the synonymy of species, because what's a common name in one part of the country is not a common name in another part of the country. So this was actually the work of Sue Meads, and she is a botanist who really got into this stuff. She worked closely with the folks who work on the flora of North America. So this taxonomy is pretty good. It's again, pretty confident about how all this works. And the other map on this right-hand side is, because David asked for this, you can get the so-called annuclim models, which is what you see here. Those are the very simple climate envelopes, which I think are pretty darn good for what we should be using them for, which is kind of almost like symbolic interpretations of where things are going. Then there's the MaxEnt model, which is another kind of approach. Something to remember about the observations that we get. They're like presence-only observations, not presence-absence. MaxEnt sort of turns the observations into sort of a presence-absence data, and does a little bit more sophisticated modeling and comes up with something almost like a probability of occurrence. And it shows, so, a way to interpret this is that in this case, the kind of warmer colors, the greener and redder colors, are more akin to the core zone as compared to the annuclim output. So that's that. Sweetgrass, you asked for that too, David. So again, this is probably one where we don't have as many observations, but again, this is something that we've had people get in touch with us who have an interest in a particular species or suite of them, and they have observations, they make a contribution, and we rerun the models, and it just adds value to them. A way to always say that these are all work in progress. The more observations you have, the more robust the models are. And we do go through some processes when we create the models that make sure we're not getting what I sort of call the Hamilton naturalist effect, because they all go and sample the same pond or the same park and get, so you're getting 800 of the 900 observations from basically one climatic space. So we make sure that that there's at least 10 kilometers between any observation that we use in the creation of the models. So you see that in this case, sweetgrass, the sort of core range, at least at this stage of the game, suggests that over time the sort of Ontario climate may become more favorable to sweetgrass. So this just a couple of examples just to show you that we're doing this for trees. I think we've got like 700 tree species in North America that we have probably models for. And again, I don't think there's anything kind of new or mind-blowing with these things, other than as it gets further into the future, you can see the so-called core range for these boreal species shifting further and further north. In fact, the paper that we published, well, both our bioscience paper and then a couple of years later, we did a paper in Global Change Biology where we sort of summarized the climatic shifts for major tree species in Canada in particular, but for how many species were it, John? For about 140 or 160 tree species, the average shift north by the end of the century was over 700 kilometers for the climate, which is kind of mind-blowing, hard to believe, disturbing if these models are correct, because I would certainly think it's going to cause incredible stresses to the ecosystems, and also require significant effort to really think about how to best deal with it and adapt and deal with forest management in a way that is climate smart. So that was Populus tremuloides, and here's white birch, Betula papyrifera. So similar sorts of things. You'll notice every one is a little bit different, and I think that's an important thing to remember, that everything's going to have a sort of individual response. That's another reason why community, what we think of as sort of fairly standard and stable plant communities might not necessarily be so stable and standard going into the future. Black spruce, another important species for boreal systems, and are the people that rely on the boreal and live in the boreal. So there's one for that. And here's just quickly, I'll just finish up with one or two more slides. Hopefully I'm not going too long here, David. So we've started doing this for insects and diseases. We've actually worked a little bit with people in Public Health Agency of Canada, looking at things like, tick. We've provided them data for changes in tick distributions, even looking at mosquitoes. So you can get insect and disease occurrence data from CFS. Used to do a lot of that. The FIDS stood for the Forest Insect and Disease Survey. We don't do that so much anymore, unfortunately. But then there's a global databases. Global Biodiversity Information Framework, I think that stands for. So we've scraped the web for some of those things, and again, created models, and much like what we've done for plant hardiness. The website's a little bit more kind of a work in progress, but again, it provides current and future species distribution or climate distribution or species distribution models in relation to climate for lots of different insects and diseases. And in some cases, one of the things we've done with this that's different is we've coupled volume, spatially explicit wood volumes with these models, so that we can actually report where there might be some exposure to particular pests. Now, this is just for a select number of species. It's with 20,000 insect species. You can see that it's not something that we could do quickly. This is another thing that we've done kind of on the side of the desk, but I think it's a pretty cool website, and has some good application for the people who are deeper divers into this kind of thing. So that web application is online, but it's not as slick as we would like. We're hoping that over the fall and the winter that we'll be able to maybe make it a little bit slicker and more user friendly. So, and here's just an example of one of them that might be an interesting one to consider is southern pine beetle, which is a problem in southern U.S. Pine forest. But over time, these are the max scent models. It certainly would show that the climate shifts would suggest that southern pine beetle would become more amenable to moving northward and could possibly enter the pine forests of Canada. So that's that. So just to summarize, yeah, Canada is projected to experience increased temperature. I'm going to give John a chance to add anything too. Just give you a warning, John, if you want to add anything. Canada is expected to experience increased temperature, higher precip, more extreme weather over the course of the century, certainly more probably volatility. The degree of change is dependent on the emission pathway, but we are locked into some change. There is no doubt about that. Warmness expected to outpace wetness, but that is a tough one because, with extreme precipitation events, it all depends on the timing and how that all plays out, and that's a very difficult thing to be able to predict. I mean, hard enough in a given year that we're in, let alone 10, 25, 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now. But it could suggest that we could approach prairie-like conditions in some parts of the province. We've done work with a climate moisture index that shows some of this, and we use the climate moisture index with our wildfire modeling that we did. There's a lot of adaptation tools that have been created by CFS researchers, not just ourselves. There's a website for that. I probably know all about that anyway. And just the last point that at least I think that climate change is going to variably affect individual forest species and plant communities. So it will create challenges for people, and we need a lot of monitoring. That reminded me that I was going to mention this cocoa Ross thing, David, that maybe save that for another time. But there are much less weather stations than have been available in the past. We even here at our building, we've joined this Cocoa Ross, this community. It's a North American wide thing that was started out of Colorado State, and there's some 600 locations now, 650 stations across Canada now that record precipitation and enter it each day. It's a great contribution. They do have materials for training, including some oriented for Indigenous groups. Really, it's just a matter of putting in observations when you can, including snow measurements with a ruler. It's really pretty easy. So I'd encourage, if you think that there are people around that might be interested, I'd be more than happy to talk about that later, and we can put you in touch with some of the folks in Environment Canada that are helping to promote that. The uptake of that sort of stuff in Canada, because it really is, for all kinds of reasons, important for us to add to the network of precipitation monitoring in Canada. So maybe John, did you have something I forgot to say, or I got on the roll there?
I think you covered most of the bases there, Dan. I would just maybe reiterate a few caveats around the models. Namely, they are purely climate based, so there's no consideration of soils in there. So when we're showing future climate envelopes, all of those areas may not be entirely suitable for a plant to actually survive or move into. And as Dan had mentioned, we're not considering migration capabilities associated with these models. So again, even though the climate envelope moves a substantial distance, the species may, well, almost surely won't move that far, and may may not move very far at all. Trees historically have moved, looks like around 10 to 50 kilometers per century, whereas these climate envelopes are moving more like 500 kilometers per century. So they're falling quite far behind where the climate is moving to. And I guess that sort of leads to the topic, and I don't think you touched on this too much, Dan, but this notion of assisted migration. So really, in a way, one of the better values of these models is for identifying where suitable locations are in the future that we might assist the movement of some of these plant species to help conserve the species, or sort of provide some environmental well, to help continue to provide the services that they provide. For example, blueberries and such. There may be a need to assist in some of the migration of blueberries in the future. But,
Yeah, that's an important point. And assisted migration has, yes, has become a big sort of topic in the literature for the last few years. And yeah, John's led a couple of really good papers on that too. So it's something that he's talked about across the country now. Anyway, David, yabbering on too much. Thanks, John. Those were great points.